Ridiculous jobs that no longer exist. In this day and age, we really take for granted just how quick and easy it is to be able to communicate. Back in the days of yore, not everyone was rolling around at the speed of sound. It could take several weeks to be able to relay critical information to your buddies, and a lot can change in just a few weeks. Nevertheless, delayed information was better than no information at all, and that's why highly trained long-distance messengers could make or break empires. First used thousands of years ago in ancient times, couriers were the best and fastest form of communication pretty much up until the invention of the telegraph in 1837. Sure, boats and trains made things a tad bit faster, but the principle was pretty much unchanged, physically transporting documents from point A to point B. The earliest and most sophisticated courier system of its time was that of the massive and girthy Achaemenid Empire, also known as, or at least considered to be, the First Persian Empire. They constructed the Angarium, a series of relay stations littered across the Royal Road, the main vein of the empire. This connected two major cities within the empire, Susa and Sardis. Can you deliver this message to Sardis? Yeah, no problem at all. Sardis, no. The Royal Road stretched across 1,700 miles of the empire's western half with patrolling guards and security stations at regular intervals, making it heavily secured. I mean, it kind of had to be. Messengers traveling down the road were carrying the orders from the Great King himself, so they were pretty important. Anyone severing or intercepting that line of communication could cause devastating effects. Also at regular intervals were checkpoints. These were relay stations that housed freshly charged horses as well as other messengers ready to pass things along down the line. This system of stations dropped delivery time from roughly 90 days on foot to just 7 to 9 days on horseback. But what if you didn't have horses? Well, we'd have to ask the Inca. Jump forward 2,000 years to the 1500s, and not much has changed in the ways of communication. In fact, one could argue that it was way worse. With no horses around, Incan runners instead relied on their piggies. Messengers of the king, called the Chasquis, were slim, fit, and ready to rip, carrying messages across the vast mountainsides of the Inca Empire. Unlike their Persian counterparts, the Inca didn't carry the messages in their pockets, but rather their noggins. And that's because the Inca did not have any formal written language. Wild, right? Instead, apart from some complex numerical systems involving tied knots of string, everything was spoken, so a strong memory was the key to getting the right message across. The Chasquis were tasked with relaying the king's orders to nearby provinces and military commanders. Tell the soldiers that they're doing a solid job and to keep up the great work. Yes, my king. The Inca, though, did rely on relay stations to always have a fresh pair of legs ready to deliver a message. According to Spanish chroniclers, that's a fun word to say, each station was about a half a league apart, but could be as far as a league and a half. That's over 5 miles, or for you metric fellas, over 832,000 centimeters. The stations were more or less weather-resistant small huts with other Chasquis standing about, ready to get a move on. Upon arriving, the first messenger would give the oral performance for his buddies, and then repeat the message that he came with. After memorizing the information, the next Chasqui sprinted up to 5 miles to the next station. Now keep in mind, this was the Inca Empire. It wasn't easily traversed flat road. It was pretty much uphill both ways, wobbly, cobbly stone roads 10,000 feet above sea level, on par with how our parents walk to and from school every day, or so they claim. The king said to slob his knob, and that Greg's a jerk. The fuck did I do? It's unfortunate that sometimes things get lost in translation, but remember the first rule of exchanging information. Never shoot the messenger. Leave it to the English to come up with some spooky dooky hocus pocus type stuff. If you're extremely poor and a social outcast with no lucrative or meaningful skills whatsoever, then the profession of Sin Eater might have been on the menu for you. Blimey. Historically, the job was performed throughout the early 17th century up until the 19th century, mostly in England, Scotland, and Wales. So just this area. As a Sin Eater, you were always on call for your services, as people have a tendency of kicking the bucket at any given time. So while you sat slapping mud around all day outside your thatched roof cottage, you could receive the news of a local death at the drop of a hat. Oh, he's dead. A relative or loved one would seek out your services almost immediately after the passing had passed. Once you were summoned, you'd pull up your britches and tween off screen to convene with the spiritually unclean. Arriving at the door, you politely knock before entering. You waddle inside to see your new customer and get to work. So your job as the local sin eater was to, as you could probably guess, eat the sins of the deceased, as praying and repentance apparently wasn't good enough. Now, the eating of the sins was of course symbolic in nature, but it was conducted in a literal fashion. The family of the dearly departed presented the sin eater with food, usually bread and beer. The food was placed on the chest or face of the individual right as they had passed away, supposedly sucking up all the bad juju as the soul floated to regions beyond. So, now with the food being properly seasoned with a pinch of immorality and a dash of transgression, it was time to chow down. The basic idea of the whole ceremony was that you would effectively absolve the dead of any wrongdoings committed in life, allowing them a clean slate departure for the heavens as a certified good boy. Now you're probably not surprised to learn that this was far from a Michelin-star dining experience. The bread was all stale and the beer was warm with a bunch of gross floaties in it, perfect for the hipsters, but less than ideal for normal people. So after munching and crunching and glugging and chugging, you'd say a quick yet emotionally packed prayer. Rub-dub-dub, thanks for the grub. Yay God. Where's the shitter? Now with a proper sense of closure, you'd receive your paltry fee and be promptly vacated from the premises. So while your work of purifying one's soul was well appreciated, you were looked down upon, even outcasted. The belief was that you'd retain all of these absorbed sins, polluting your own soul in the process. That being the case, sin eaters were forced to live reclusive and isolated lives, being hated, ridiculed, and shunned by the locals. Until it was time to deep throat a sin or 12. It's not exactly clear how the tradition of sin eating was started. Some believe that it derives from the Jewish tradition of the scapegoat, a literal goat that was imbued with all of the local sins and troubles, sent out into the wilderness and actively prodded off a cliff, taking all of the town's trials and tribulations with it. Atonement complete. Thanks, Mr. Goat. As for sin eating, it seems that the tradition was finally laid to rest in the beginning of the 20th century with the death of Richard Munslow, the last known sin eater in England. He reportedly was a humble and well-loved farmer who took on the job after the premature deaths of his children. Very sad. All in all, sin eating really was a self-sacrifice when you look at it, trading in any sense of social standing for a few pence. But hey, free bread and beer. If you thought your childhood was rough, imagine dipping, diving, ducking, and dodging your way through cannon fire while slugging a heavy sack of gunpowder on a ship in the middle of the ocean. That's what powder monkeys had to deal with almost on a daily basis. So while you may have been pissed at your mom for taking your Game Boy away for a few days, powder monkeys were grateful if they even saw tomorrow. Back during the Age of Sail, naval warfare was a pretty common occurrence, ships just blasting big metal balls at each other in hopes of sinking the other guy faster or causing enough damage to warrant a surrender. In order to give yourself a fighting chance, you needed a well-trained, well-supplied crew who knew their way around cannons. Besides ammunition, the cannons needed a propellant to send those cannonballs barreling at the faces of the enemy. That propellant, of course, was gunpowder. In the heat of battle, every trained sailor needed to man their stations and execute their responsibilities in order to have a decent shot at survival. But one responsibility that didn't need much training outside of carry this shit and run over there was that of supplying powder to the cannoneers. Since there wasn't much to the job description, the task was given to young boys, usually between the ages of 12 and 14. You see, back in this time, between the 16th and 19th centuries, people were just cranking out kids, especially the poor. Simultaneously, nature was just cranking out infectious and deadly diseases, and industry was cranking out fatal working conditions, both of which were promptly streamlining children into the orphanage pipeline. This, of course, caused orphanages to become overburdened, and they needed some relief. And where's the best place to put able-bodied youngsters just looking for any kind of future? The military, of course. European and eventually American navies were scooping up hundreds of impoverished chaps each year and dumping them on ships to take on the role of powder monkey, more often than not against their will. But the young lads were quicker, more agile, and physically smaller than their adult counterparts, making them perfect candidates for the job. During a battle, each boy would quickly carry at least 2 leather cases housing powder cartridges from the ship's powder magazine deep down in the hull, all the way up to the cannons. A dangerous job for sure, but a critical one for the success of the skirmish. Oi lad, bring me that very explosive powder, eh? And be quick about it.
Yes, sir. Right away, sir.
That's a good lad. In exchange, the young fellows were clothed, fed, and given beds, even a little bit of education to fill their heads. The plan was to have the boys eventually become official, full-time members of the Navy, assuming that they survived to adulthood. Yet despite the fact that they were a key part of the crew, they held no formal naval rank on the ships which they served. Now, while it was nice to have a place to call home, clothes on your back, and food in your belly, it of course came with the steep price of witnessing the horrors of war. Just to clarify, I said that powder monkeys were usually between the ages of 12 and 14, but in reality, some were much younger, with some documentation showing cases of children as young as 7 years old. These little guys were subjected to watching their fellow crewmen being blown to smithereens, impaled by split bits of ship, blinded by shrapnel, or having limbs ripped from rogue cannon fire. None of which they were immune to themselves, mind you. It wasn't until the end of the War of 1812 that formal regulations were put in place, preventing any recruitment of powder monkeys under the age of 12 from serving on ships in the United States. The British followed in suit with an age limit of 13 for the role, though these age restrictions were still often ignored. The practice did, however, fully die out in the mid-1800s once child labor laws were put in place and technology made the role obsolete. Sorry kids, looks like it's a big old box of PTSD for Christmas this year. Medieval medicine was wild. Physicians back then were really just throwing anything at the wall to see what stuck, which led to a bunch of strange medical practices that would, luckily, fall out of favor once modern medicine emerged. One such practice was that of uroscopy, the art and science of checking out your pee to determine your health. Now I know what you're thinking. Isn't this still used in the modern day? Yes, but no. Urinalysis, as it's practiced today, uses chemical, physical, and microscopic analysis of urine samples to generate quantitative data for diagnosis. Uroscopy, on the other hand, well, it had dudes snooping, sniffing, and sipping your pee. Well, Doc? I need a second opinion. Now, you might be surprised to know that the practice of uroscopy has been around for thousands and thousands of years. The earliest known evidence that historians have dates all the way back to the 4th millennium BC, where some ancient Sumerian physicians took note of urinary color. Perhaps the most profound early evidence that we have comes from the ancient Egyptians around 1550 BC. This is the Ebers Papyrus, a 65-foot-long medical scroll from ancient Egypt's New Kingdom era. This single document details over 800 diagnoses and remedies for all kinds of conditions ranging from skin problems, eye problems, burns, tumors, a limp, broken bones, backwards teeth, brown parasites, and of course, urinary conditions. The study and examination of urine continued for a while, but the formal occupation of uroscopist is believed to have been introduced between the 4th and 7th centuries in the Byzantine Empire, hitting its peak in the Middle Ages. According to medieval Welsh medical texts, it was believed that urine was the filtrate of the 4 humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Of course, we now know that your pee is the product of your kidneys filtering your blood and excess water, but hey, medical science was still a baby back then. Because of this theory, uroscopists believed that urine was the end-all be-all for determining a person's health status, and thus, it was the most important substance to study. The most telling quality of the urine was its color, so after collecting a fresh sample, a real fresh sample, the color was immediately observed. But a problem with qualitative analysis is that it's completely subjective, whereas quantitative is objective. When it comes to subjectivity, one PP doctor may interpret the same color differently than another. For objectivity, numbers are numbers, there's no argument there. In order to mitigate subjectivity and establish some sort of consistency, the piss percipients often constructed quick reference guides to use as a standard for diagnosis, sharing their knowledge across heavily detailed manuscripts. As an example, if your urine was clear, you might have some spleen issues. If it was dark red, your liver's too hot. Green, you've got jaundice. Black, well, wait, is black urine a thing? Oh God. Yeah, I don't think you're gonna be doing too well if you're inking out your dink. While you had the visual aspect, Uroscopus also ventured down the avenues of smell and taste to solidify the reasonings if a diagnosis couldn't be immediately deciphered from color alone. Urine that tasted sweet was evidence of diabetes, whereas stinky pee-pee usually meant infection. Now, while this may seem silly looking at it through a modern lens, there was some validity to the practice. Uroscopists were able to properly diagnose conditions like diabetes and jaundice through their practices. Diagnosis was great and all, but without proper and effective treatment, you're not going to be making much progress, except just being closer to the grave. It's like if someone tells you, hey, your car is broken, and then proceeds to offer no meaningful solution. At that point, they're just taking the piss. The ultra-wealthy really love spending their money on stupid shit. They love it, in fact. When you've got more money than you could spend in 50 lifetimes, why not? Dumping the most expensive champagne on luxury watches, a fifth mansion on the beach, rigging elections, whatever tickles their sacks. But ostentatious spending is nothing new. You see, back in the 1700s, wealthy estate owners in England, Ireland, and Scotland were bored out of their skulls. I mean, think about it. The extent of dopamine rushes back then were what? Attending yet another opulent ball, hunting some wildlife, racing a horse or two, then putting them down when they don't win. And when you felt like a real degenerate, you had excessive gambling. But these frivolous activities got stale real quick. There needed to be something fresh, something grand, something right in your own backyard. That's when the idea of the English landscape gardens started to bloom, transforming sprawling grounds of estates into picturesque and serene scenes. Replacing the clear-cut and formal gardens of their French counterparts, English landscapes were to appear engineered by nature itself, with natural slopes, ponds, groupings of trees and flowers, a nice boulder or two, and organic decoration. These established wonderful getaways for owners and guests alike to retreat and get in touch with nature. But for some, all the stone and trees and grass just wasn't cutting it. Something was missing, something human, like a person. Believe it or not, some wealthy fellas sought out to hire real-life people as decorations for their gardens. Take, for example, one Joseph Pocklington. Born into a wealthy banking family and receiving his inheritance at just 26 years old, his priority was to just spend the shit out of it. After all, what's the point of having money if you don't spend it? As my dad always tells me, you only live once, son. Enjoy it. Well, Mr. Pocklington over here made damn sure he was going to enjoy the life he was given. After purchasing his own private island on a lake, he commissioned the construction of his own armed fortress, a druid temple, and several natural grottos. In order to make the estate seem more lively, he advertised employment for a man to live in his garden, demanding that the man, quote, live for 7 years without washing or cutting his hair or nails. The man was to never speak or interact with any guests and would spend his lonely days in an artificial cave. The basic idea was for guests to observe a man in his most natural state, untouched by societal influence. If the man was able to carry out these conditions, he would be paid the equivalent of about $100,000 in today's money. Now that's spread over the whole 7 years, so it's not really that much. But the position was dubbed the Ornamental Garden Hermit. Now get this, Pocklington was not the only fella to come up with this idea. Others employed their own hermits with much more lenient rules. Perhaps the most well-known example was the Hill family from Shropshire. Their botanical bro was dubbed Father Francis, and he fully interacted with guests, told stories, and dispensed his own wisdom, all while maintaining a mysterious yet comforting presence.
I want to see the hermit, mummy. I want to see the hermit.
The trend of the ornamental garden hermit lasted just over a century, finally being uprooted in the 1830s in favor of living statues. And to answer your question, no, garden gnomes were not inspired by the garden hermit. Those came from Germanic folklore, hundreds of years prior, but they'll still guard your garden as best they can.